This lecture will cover physical and cognitive development in adolescence. Adolescence is the life stage that occurs after middle childhood and before early adulthood. The onset of adolescence is typically characterized by the onset of puberty, and so therefore it begins anywhere from the ages of about 10 to 12. With regard to physical development in adolescence, we'll begin with the topic of puberty, then discuss sexual activity, drug use in adolescence, brain growth, as well as health issues. Then we will move on to cognitive development, where we'll be discussing adolescent egocentrism and effective schools. So, the average age of puberty onset has declined significantly since the 1850s. What historical records show is that in the 1850s, the onset of puberty was somewhere around the ages of 16 years of age. And fast forward 150 years, we see that the onset of puberty on average is about 11 to 12 years of age. And we also see that some children are going through puberty at much earlier. We see that early onset puberty is associated with endocrine glandular issues. We see that it is much more common in the African American ethnic group, specifically female African Americans, and even more specifically overweight female African Americans. And so being African American, being female, and being overweight, all of these are risk factors for early onset puberty. And we'll be discussing some of the consequences associated with early onset puberty. So what we see is that boys that experience early onset puberty, boys that go through puberty at the age of 10 as opposed to 12, these boys are actually much more confident than their peers. They're typically more popular, but they are also slightly more prone to aggression. Obviously, with boys in the onset of puberty, we're seeing much higher levels of testosterone, which is associated with aggression, and so they're just going to be, I guess, stronger and larger and slightly more aggressive and assertive than their peers who have not gone through puberty or have not started puberty. And it's important to understand that puberty is about a 4-year process, and so although these boys may be going through puberty at the age of 10, they may not complete their puberty until the age of about 14 or 15. And when they are 14 or 15 and they have completed their puberty, we're going to have some of their peers that just started puberty at the ages of 12, maybe even as late as 13. And so there's going to be a significant difference in their physical development. What we see with girls is that the consequences of early onset puberty are much more severe, much more negative. Girls are much more likely to smoke and drink and be depressed as a result of early onset puberty. We see that they're much more likely to develop an eating disorder, which we'll be discussing later in this lecture. They're going to struggle for earlier independence, which is normal and common for teenagers and adolescents, but so the earlier they go through puberty, the earlier they begin adolescence, the earlier they're going to be seeking independence. I think the same thing can be said for smoking and drinking. Obviously, these are behaviors that we associated with adolescence and early adulthood, and so the sooner that we go through puberty, the sooner we're likely to encounter these kinds of behaviors. And an interesting trend is that we see that males, it's common for males to engage in intimate relationships with females that are slightly younger than they are. And so if we have a boy who's 15 years of age, he's more likely going to initiate some sort of social interaction on an intimate level with a girl who's 13 that has already gone through several years of puberty. And so what ends up happening to these girls that are 13 and 14 years of age who have already concluded or gone through several years of puberty, they're much more likely to be dating boys that are older than them, and so they're more likely to be exposed to an older age group. And of course, this older age group is, compared to a younger age group, is going to be having higher rates of smoking and drinking, and of course be seeking more independence from their parents. What we see here on the right is basically changes in body image. As we see, earlier development is associated with a more positive body image score, except in grade 6. And so with early development, in grade 6, we see a higher positive body score, but with later development in grade 6, it's a lower body image score. But then it kind of gets inverted at grade 10. And so what that's showing is that early onset puberty seems to be a positive thing when it occurs, when it starts, but as the years progress, it's not as desirable. Sexual activity is associated with many factors in adolescence, including drug use, juvenile delinquency, which includes behaviors like vandalism, theft, and graffiti, school-related problems that could be academic or behavioral, low socioeconomic status, neglectful and permissive parenting, as well as pornography usage. And so there's an interesting research study that's linked here that describes some of the influences of pornography usage in adolescents and how it affects sexual activity. So it's important to consider, that these are correlations, and so if we look at the relationship between sexual activity and drug use, we see that as one of those variables increases, so does the other. Which one is causing the influence in the other? Is there a causal influence? Obviously, sexual activity and socioeconomic status, it's not practical to think that sexual activity is going to result in lower socioeconomic status, but what we see is that lower socioeconomic status is likely to lead to sexual activity at a younger age. What we see over here on the right is some data that's been collected to describe the sexual activity of high schoolers in the United States of America. What we see is that general sexual activity has decreased significantly from 1991 to 2011. So 1991 is shown in blue, 2011 is shown in this orange-yellow color here. And so what we see is that although it's still fairly consistent, the decline isn't drastic. It is significant and worth noting. But basically what we can see is that it seems that about half of all high schoolers in the United States from 9th to 12th grade, about half of them have had sexual intercourse. I'm sure that if we looked at the data a little bit closer, it'd probably more skewed towards the 11th graders and the 12th graders. But if that's the case, then it's probably likely to understand that when we look at the later ages of seniors and juniors, they probably have a rate higher than 50%. If we're going to believe that the freshmen and sophomores have a rate of lower than 50%, because obviously it needs to average out. We see that about a third of them are sexually active currently, which means that they probably had sex in the past week or the past month. We see that a small percentage of them, about 5 to 10%, had sexual intercourse before the age of 13. And then we see that about 15 to 20% of them have had sexual intercourse with 4 or more people. Now, it's important to understand that this data is collected through surveys, and so there are problems with surveys. People may not understand the questions. They may lie on the surveys, but this is the data that we're collecting from the students that we've surveyed. What are adolescents being taught about sex? So with regard to sex education, there's basically 2 different approaches. We have an abstinence-only approach, which is very popular, basically saying that children should not have sex, or basically instructing children they should avoid and abstain from sexual activity as much as possible. And then we have comprehensive sex education, which doesn't necessarily promote sexual activity in theory. What it really does is basically encourage safe sex practices like the use of contraception, as well as communicates the behavior of sexuality and how it should be essentially something that is, respected and also enjoyed by both parties. Basically preaching against sexual harassment at an early age. And so there's, critics are concerned that, comprehensive sex education is likely to increase sexual activity. But, if we're to believe that the data is true, that about half of high schoolers have had sexual activity, and we see that the majority of sex education is an abstinence-only approach, I think it's worth questioning whether or not the abstinence-only approach is effective. We're preaching, we're trying to communicate a philosophy of abstaining from sex, yet it seems that, for many of students, it's not being effective because they are engaging in sexual activity. Of course, one of the major concerns of sexual activity in adolescence is adolescent pregnancy. We see that teenage moms are much more likely to drop out and live in poverty, and the children of these mothers are more likely to have a low birth weight. They're more likely to experience neurological issues and more likely to develop childhood illnesses. And it's very cyclic. And what that means is that children of adolescent parents are more likely to be adolescent parents themselves. And so the video that's linked in this slide is is a really good insight as to into the cycle of teenage pregnancy. With regard to brain development in adolescent, the adolescent brain is a really interesting and critical period that's prime for learning and addiction. And so we see a lot of teenagers becoming addicted to cell phones, being addicted to video games, being addicted to the internet, being addicted to high-risk behaviors like driving fast, or whether it be drinking or marijuana. They're experiencing these behavioral addictions, and so one of the reasons for this is that the brain is not completely finished in its growth and development. It's still changing drastically. We see that the limbic system is almost fully developed. Is almost fully developed. This is a group of structures where emotions and rewards are processed. It includes structures like the hippocampus and the amygdala. The amygdala primarily controls emotions, things like anger and aggression. And so the prefrontal cortex is the part of the adolescent brain which is still really underdeveloped. It's responsible for reasoning and decision-making, impulse control. And so one of the reasons that teenagers struggle with understanding their emotions and controlling their emotions and managing their emotions is because there's still a lack of connection between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for, allowing us to process information, allowing us to process our emotions and deal with them in a mature, orderly fashion. But because it's still underdeveloped, the amygdala is very strong, for a lack of a better explanation. The amygdala is still very powerful and kind of overpowers the prefrontal cortex. And so that's one of the reasons why teenagers can be very, very emotional humans. Well, it might not be that they're any more or less emotional than adults. It's really more that they struggle with communicating their emotions and regulating them. We see a slight decline in exercise in adolescence. About 20% of adolescents are either classified as overweight or obese, and so obviously that's going to set up or be a predictor of a lot of health issues that are going to arise in middle adulthood, which we'll be discussing later in this course. Teenagers tend to have a strong preoccupation with body image. Of course, their bodies are changing, so that's something that they're focused on and concerned about. This tends to impact girls much more negatively. Girls are much more likely to develop an eating disorder. About 95% of eating disorders are diagnosed to females rather than males. The two most common eating disorders are anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. Both of them are characterized by a distorted body image and an intense fear of weight gain. The major difference is from a behavioral standpoint that with anorexia, it's typically characterized by irrational calorie restriction and an intense exercise regimen. Whereas with bulimia nervosa, the behavioral pattern is more characterized by a binge and purge pattern. So basically eating and forcing regurgitation, or forcing themselves to throw up. This video here of anorexia nervosa is a really, really interesting case study of a girl from Europe who's diagnosed with anorexia, and I think at some point she talks about trying to be her dream goal is 14 stone, I think, and I think or it might be something like 8 stone. Anyway, she uses a very weird unit of measurement. Let me see, stone. So a stone is 14 pounds, and I think that her goal was to get down to 7 or 8 stone, which is something around 80 pounds. And so it's just really, really shocking to think that there's, that's kind of an ideal weight that someone would want to have. So that's a great case study to look at to get a better understanding of anorexia nervosa. Suicide. Suicide is the third leading cause of adolescence. The main cause is unintentional injuries, and so we're going to be looking at in a moment some of the poor decision making associated with adolescence and some of the high risk behaviors that they engage in. And so we're talking about drunk driving, driving recklessly, playing with firearms. All of those are unintentional injuries that can be avoided, but because teenagers are so bad at making decisions, they hurt themselves and they unintentionally kill themselves. Homicide is the second leading cause of death in adolescence. So it's very, very fascinating to consider that we were just talking about development in middle childhood between the ages of 6 and 10, and It's extremely rare to hear of a 10-year-old or a 9-year-old committing homicide. So we see this major shift in human development where just over the course of 4 or 5 years, all of a sudden we are intentionally, as humans, we're intentionally killing other people. And then, of course, we're also intentionally killing ourselves, unfortunately, with suicide. We see that boys are much more likely to engage in suicide than females, and so that's also a major cause for concern that we have. So, with regard to cognitive development, the major topic is going to be adolescent egocentrism. Adolescent egocentrism is a period of heightened self-consciousness characterized by social misperceptions. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. Social misperceptions. So this has to do with social interactions and the way that they perceive them, and they are perceiving them incorrectly. They're skewed or they're biased in the way that they are thinking about how these social interactions have taken place or will take place. So with regard to imaginary audience, this is in anticipation of how the individual will be perceived by others in social situations. And so they may be very concerned about how they're going to be perceived at school, or how they're going to be perceived at a party, or in the classroom when they say something. And so that fear is going to cloud a lot of their judgment and decision making. It might cause them to avoid some of those social interactions. They might fear about how they're going to be perceived by someone if they go up to them and initiate social interaction. And so they might avoid that kind of behavior in general. On the other hand, that might also lead them to engage in attention-seeking behavior. And so because they're so concerned about how they're going to be perceived, they might make a concerted effort. They might go the additional mile, if you will, to essentially try to do something that makes them appear to be cool. Whether that be engaging in substance use, or using curse words, or engaging in some sort of behavior that kind of puts the attention on them because they believe that that attention is desirable, and they believe that that's going to essentially increase their popularity or increase how they're accepted by the rest of the students or their peers. And of course, many times this is completely unreliable or just illogical thinking, and there's no basis or foundation to it. It's completely emotionally based. It lacks logic, and it lacks reason. With regard to personal fable, that's the second component of adolescent egocentrism. This is characterized by having a unique sense of self, if you will. Basically, believing that in their thoughts and their emotions are so unique that they cannot possibly be understood by others, including their parents. And so it's very common for children, for adolescents, to feel misunderstood, to feel as if their relationship problems, their school problems, their physical development is so unique to them that it cannot be understood or processed by anyone else, when the truth of the matter is that many of the challenges that we experience in school and in social situations were faced by our parents and have been faced by our friends and our teachers. And the other thing about personal fable is that many teenagers feel that they are invincible, in the sense that they believe that death is something that does not occur in teenagers, and that's also one of the reasons why they are likely to engage in these high-risk behaviors, because they feel as if nothing bad can happen to them. They don't have the ability to process risks, and that's one of the reasons why people make a concerted effort to show children, show teenagers the effects of, for example, drinking and driving, or other high-risk behaviors, so that way they can get a better understanding of the fact that teenagers do die, teenagers do commit suicide, teenagers do engage in poor decision making that can lead to dire consequences. Of course, it takes experience, it takes life experience to understand these things, and so we can't lose track of the fact that they are still very young. They still only have about maybe 10 years of real life experience when it comes to social interactions, because of course the first few years of life are just based on biological developments, mostly based on biological developments, and we can't really remember much of the first 2 or 3 years of life. But once we start entering school and society, that's when we really start to develop our social skills, and it takes a while for them to fully mature. These cartoons are basically just some examples of adolescent egocentrism. Having these misperceptions having to do with social situations, just basically allowing their emotions to override their logical thinking abilities. And so thinking back to the relationship between the amygdala and the underdeveloped prefrontal cortex, we can see that a lot of that is going on here. These teenagers are just not doing a good job of thinking critically and logically about the context of the social situation, feeling that their experience is extremely unique and cannot be understood by other people, highly anticipating without any sort of reason or logic the perceptions of other people, of how they're going to be, basically how their own behavior is going to be perceived, which in all reality, that's typically misguided. Now, with regard to cognitive development in adolescence, we must look at the quality of schools. What researchers show is that effective schools have many characteristics in common, including one, low student counselor ratios. And so you look at the ACIT program at Brazosport College. The idea of that is that students are assigned a coach or a mentor or a guide or kind of a counselor, and so that way these counselors, these professors, everyone is assigned a handful of students, and that allows us to do is spend an increased amount of time with these students devoted to their planning and their decision making for their academic goals. Because if you consider a public high school with 3,000 students and they only have 4 or 5 guidance counselors, how can we expect that these counselors are going to be able to spend a significant amount of time talking with these children on an individual basis, spending more than an hour with each one? Effective schools involve parents, whether that be hosting, parent-teacher conferences, or making sure that parents have an opportunity to have their voices heard and their concerns heard, or ensuring that children are given an opportunity to work with their parents in completing homework assignments. Effective schools integrate disciplines in a flexible curriculum. What that means is they give teenagers options in the courses that they take that cater to the students' interests as well as their strengths. They integrate disciplines, which means that they have writing in science classes, they have writing in math classes. That's typically the easiest way to integrate disciplines, is to ensure that students are always writing, because language is a very difficult skill to develop, and so it's important that we not only focus 1 hour of the day in developing our language when we take our language arts class, but we also try to improve it while we're learning about other concepts like math as well as science and social studies, of course. Effective schools promote health and fitness, whether that be providing healthy food options or providing birth control. And for example, in some of the case studies we saw in the discussions forum, all of that involves student health, and as well as fitness, ensuring that students are provided with ample opportunities for exercise. Research has shown time and time again that there's a direct link between physical activity and cognitive performance. And of course, provide health care. Whether that be, like I said, the birth control, or whether that be in a more advanced setting, mental health care. And so that's what we're likely to see a lot of major developments in probably in the next decade, with a lot of our high schools and a lot of our community colleges ensuring that we have a licensed professional counselor on staff that is trained in coaching and teaching about coping with anxiety and depression and substance abuse. And then we're also very concerned with why students are dropping out of school. What we see is that Latinos, compared to other ethnic groups, are much more likely to drop out of high school regardless of gender. And so that's a cultural concern that we have, and that's something that has been going on for quite a while. But of course, there's other factors, including teenage pregnancy, socioeconomic status, all of these things. But of course, it's not going to be surprising if, based on the data, if we're seeing that teenage pregnancy and low socioeconomic status are correlated with one another, and those are associated with dropping out of high school, and we see that Latinos are much more likely to drop out of high school. It's not going to be surprising when we see that Latinos have a higher rate of teenage pregnancy and a higher rate of lower socioeconomic status than other ethnic groups. And that concludes my lecture on physical and cognitive development in adolescence.